Get that woman out of my house. Vanessa, lower your voice. Not in front of the donors. Not in front of the cameras. She is not a stranger. Sir, should I call medical transport? Don't let them take the bluebird. I looked down and saw it in my mother's palm. A cracked enamel pen shaped like a bluebird. 3 letters scratched beneath the wing. MWH. My father's initials. Across the foyer, the mayor lowered his champagne glass so slowly it looked like it might slip from his hand. Where did she get that? He asked. And for the first time that night, my wife stopped ordering people around. She took a step back. To understand why one little blue bird terrified the most powerful people standing in my home, I have to take you back to the morning. I found my mother behind the old bus station. If you believe no mother should ever have to prove she belongs at her own child's door, stay with me because by the end of this, I'm going to ask you to do one small thing. My name is Marcus Whitmore. I am 50 years old, and until that Tuesday, in October, I believe my mother had died before I was old enough to remember her voice. I run Whitmore Urban Renewal Group, a real estate company I built out of a single renovated duplex on the south side of Atlanta into a firm that now shapes whole blocks of this city. That morning, I stood on a stretch of cracked asphalt behind the old Greyhound station downtown, the property. My company was days from closing on the one we planned to turn into a luxury tower with a rooftop that looked out over the whole skyline. It had been raining since 5, not the loud kind, the kind that settles into a city and stays. The station had been boarded up for years, but people still gathered in the covered breezeway behind it the way water finds the same low ground even after the river's been moved. My site manager had warned me twice that the area needed to be cleared before the demolition permits went through. I told him to give it time. Standing there in the rain, I couldn't have told you why. A small crowd had formed near a row of shopping carts and flattened cardboard, the way people gather around something they already suspect is bad news. I walked over out of habit, more than curiosity. 20 years in this business teaches you to notice what other people look away from. An old woman lay against the station wall wrapped in a soaked blanket, her lips the color of ash. Somebody had already called for help, but help in that part of the city takes its time. I crouched beside her the way I crouched beside any stranger in trouble because that was all she was to me in that moment, a stranger. Then she opened her eyes, looked directly into my face, and said the words that changed everything. Little Blue. I want you to understand something about that name. Nobody had called me that in over 40 years. Not a teacher, not a friend, not one living person. My father used to call me that when I was small enough to ride on his shoulders down Auburn Avenue on Sunday mornings, back before he passed, back before I understood what the name even meant. He said it came from a song. He never finished explaining it. He died when I was 9, and the story I was raised on was simple and final. Mother had died not long after him in a fire at a shelter downtown, and I'd been raised by an aunt who did her best and a family attorney named Leonard Pike who handled what was left of my father's estate. That story had been the floor I stood on my entire adult life. And here was a dying woman behind a bus station calling me by a name that story said nobody alive should know. I didn't fall to my knees. I didn't weep in the rain like a man in a movie. I've spent my whole career learning to keep my face still while my mind works. So I kept my face still and asked her one question. What did you call me? She lifted her hand slow and shaking and opened her fingers. In her palm sat a small enamel pen chipped at the edges, shaped like a bird, the blue paint worn almost to metal in places. Your daddy gave me this, she said. Told me if our boy ever got lost, show him the bluebird. He'd know home was real. I didn't know yet if I believed her. I only knew I wasn't leaving her on that sidewalk. I called my personal physician before I called anyone else, and I put her in the back seat of my car with the heat turned all the way up and my suit jacket around her shoulders. She was so light. That's the detail that stayed with me the whole ride. A grown woman should not weigh what she weighed. She drifted in and out, mumbling things I only half caught. A hymn, a street name. My father's full name said clearly the way you say a name you've said 10,000 times in your own head and never once out loud to another living person. My phone rang 4 times before we reached the Buckhead gate. Vanessa asking why I wasn't home, reminding me the donor dinner started at 7 sharp, reminding me the mayor was already in the drawing room. I didn't tell her what I was bringing home. I didn't fully know myself. I only knew that if I was wrong about this woman, I would rather be wrong with her warm and fed than right and have left her in the rain. At a red light, she gripped my sleeve with more strength than I thought she had left. Don't let the pink lady sign me away. I didn't understand the words then. I only remember thinking that whoever the pink lady was, this woman was afraid of her the way you're afraid of someone who has already hurt you once. I had no idea how soon I'd understand exactly who she meant. That brings us back to the foyer, the dinner. My wife's voice cutting through a room full of people who mattered to our business and our name. Vanessa stood in pastel pink, her hair pulled back in the neat bun she always wore for donor nights, the picture of a woman who had never been caught without an answer. And for the first time since I'd known her, she didn't have one. The mayor was still staring at the pen. "Where did she get that?" he asked again, quieter, as if he didn't want the rest of the room to hear him ask it twice. I didn't answer him. I was watching my wife. Vanessa's eyes moved from the pen to my mother's face to mine, running some calculation I couldn't yet read. Then she turned to the guests, and her voice found its polish again, smooth as the marble under our feet. "Everyone, please help yourselves to the terrace. Marcus and I will handle this." The room emptied the way a room empties when everyone wants to leave, and nobody wants to look like they're running. Denise, our housekeeper of 11 years, caught my eye from the hallway before she disappeared toward the kitchen. She didn't say anything. She didn't need to. I had known Denise long enough to read the particular stillness on her face, the stillness of someone who has just recognized something she isn't ready to say out loud. I carried my mother up to the east guest room myself. Vanessa followed as far as the doorway and stopped there, arms folded, watching me lay a woman she believed was a stranger down on 800 thread count sheets. "We need to talk," she said. "We will, after she's warm." Vanessa found me in my study a little after 11. Once the last donor had gone and the house was quiet enough to hear rain against the windows. She didn't raise her voice. She almost never did. That was one of the things that made her so effective in every room she walked into, and so hard to argue with in the ones that mattered most. "Marcus, I need you to hear me as your wife, not your opponent." She sat across from me and folded her hands the way she did in board meetings. A woman appears out of nowhere, knows one old nickname, and suddenly she's family. People do this. They study grief. They learn just enough to sound convincing, and then they attach themselves to a man who has more heart than sense. She had the pen. Pens can be bought. Pens can be stolen. Pens can be made to look old. I'm not saying send her into the street. I'm saying we protect this family until we know the truth. A doctor, a proper evaluation, and Marcus a DNA test before this goes any further than it already has. You built this company reading people, reading contracts, reading risk. I'm only asking you to read this the same way you'd read anything else that landed on your desk unannounced with a stranger's signature and no history behind it. I'll be honest about something because it matters for everything that came after. Part of me agreed with her. It's not an easy thing to unlearn a grief you've carried since childhood, even when hope is standing in front of you. Vanessa wasn't shouting. She wasn't cruel in that moment, not in any way I could point to and name. She was careful and reasonable, and that was exactly what made her so hard to argue with. So I agreed to the test. I told myself that was caution, not doubt. I didn't yet understand that caution and doubt can wear the same face. The test would take days. In the meantime, I sat with her. I didn't ask her to prove anything. She offered it anyway, quietly. The way you offer something you've carried so long, it no longer feels like proof. It just feels like memory. She told me I had a birthmark on my left shoulder blade shaped, she said, like a comma. She was right. She told me my father used to hum a song called "Bluebird over Auburn Avenue" while he shaved in the mornings, a song I hadn't thought of in 30 years and couldn't have named the week before. She told me that when I was 4 and running a fever, I would only take my medicine mixed into peach tea, and that my father hid a little cash under a loose floorboard in our old house in case anything ever happened to him. None of that was in any file. None of it was in any newspaper story about my family because there had never been a newspaper story about my family before I made my first $1 million. I sat in that guest room a long time after she fell asleep turning it over. Vanessa's words followed me anyway. A good con artist studies grief before she knocks on a rich man's door. I hated that I couldn't fully silence that voice. I hated it more because some part of me understood exactly why it was there. I had spent my whole life being the man other people came to for help, not the man who needed rescuing. It is a strange, humbling thing to sit across from your own possible mother and still not trust your own certainty. My son, Caleb, is 12, quiet in the way. Children are quiet when they're paying closer attention than the adults realize. He found her on the third morning, sitting up in bed, humming something low. He didn't ask her for proof. He sat down at the edge of her bed and asked her what the song was. Bluebird over Auburn Avenue, she told him. Your granddaddy wrote it for me before you were even a thought in this world. That evening, Caleb came to my desk while I was reviewing site plans, his phone held out in front of him like something fragile. I recorded her singing it, Dad. I know you probably want the test to be sure, but I don't think grown-ups always need proof to know something's true. I just know. I looked at my son for a long moment, 12 years old, and he'd already worked out something it was taking his father, a man who'd built an empire, reading people and numbers days to even consider. Where'd you learn that? I asked him. From watching you. He said, before you got scared of being wrong. I didn't have an answer for that. Some nights, I still don't. What stayed with me longest wasn't even the recording. It was that Caleb had sat with her for nearly an hour before he mentioned it, asking about her favorite hymns, about what Atlanta looked like when she was young, about nothing that required proof at all. He had simply treated her like a grandmother instead of a claim to be verified. I wondered driving to the office the next morning when exactly I had lost the ability to do the same. I need to tell you the story I grew up believing because you can't understand what happened next without understanding what I lost the first time. My father, Malcolm Wendell Hayes Whitmore, went by Hayes. He died when I was 9, a heart condition nobody caught in time. I remember the funeral more than I remember him, if I'm honest. Black umbrellas, a choir singing something slow, my aunt's hand gripping mine so tight it left a mark. I was told my mother went into a decline afterward, that she'd been staying at a women's shelter downtown while she got back on her feet, and that a fire swept through part of that shelter less than a year later. I was told there was very little left to bury. I was told by Leonard Pike that it was kinder not to make a boy of 10 sit through a second funeral in 1 year. My aunt raised me after that, a good woman who worked double shifts at a hospital laundry and never once complained about the boy who came with almost nothing. She kept a framed photograph of my mother on the mantle, and some nights I would stand in front of it and try to remember the sound of her voice. I never could. By high school, the photograph had started to feel less like memory and more like a story someone had told me about a stranger, and I'd stopped trying to remember because it hurt less that way. I believed that story for 40 years. I built an entire life on top of it. I told myself that if I worked hard enough, built tall enough, signed big enough, I could make up for two parents taken from me before I was old enough to know either of them properly. What I didn't know standing in my study 40 years later with a DNA test pending upstairs was that I had spent my whole life mourning a woman who had spent that same 40 years trying to find her way back to me. Vanessa didn't cancel the following week's foundation dinner. She rescheduled it, moved it up, made it larger. We control the narrative before the narrative controls us, she told me. And I let her because some part of me still believed control was the same thing as protection. That night, in front of 40 guests, my wife introduced my mother this way. This is a woman my husband is generously helping while we verify her story, she said with the warm, easy smile that had closed 100 donor checks. We're being careful, of course, for everyone's sake. I watched something small happen in my mother's face, not anger, something quieter and sadder, the look of a woman who has been called a liability by polite people before and knows exactly how that kind of silence sounds. I watched the room recalibrate around her the way rooms do when they're given permission to be unkind without feeling unkind about it. A woman near the dessert table lowered her voice to whisper to her husband, and though I couldn't hear the words, I could read their shape. Pity dressed up as concern. A donor near the bar asked loud enough to carry, so she may not actually be his mother. We're protecting Marcus from emotional exploitation, Vanessa answered smoothly, not unkindly, which somehow made it worse. My mother's napkin slipped from her lap to the floor. A real estate partner beside her in an expensive gray suit actually stepped back from the table rather than reach down near her chair as if poverty were something you could catch off a napkin. It was Caleb who bent down and picked it up, not me. I've noticed that ever since. I haven't stopped noticing it. 3 days after that dinner, Vanessa's sapphire necklace disappeared from her vanity. Security searched the house the next morning at her request, and they found it folded into the pocket of an old coat hanging in my mother's closet. I remember standing in that doorway, looking at the necklace in the guard's gloved hand, and feeling something in my chest go very still and very cold. I don't know how that got there, my mother said. Her voice didn't shake the way you'd expect from someone caught in a lie. It shook the way a voice shakes when someone has told the truth their whole life and just realized the truth might not be enough. Vanessa didn't gloat. She never gloated. That was never her style. Marcus, she said gently, laying a hand on my arm. This is exactly why I begged you to be careful. I'm not angry at her. I think she's a woman who's had a very hard life and hard lives make people do things they wouldn't otherwise do, but I have to think about this family. I looked at my mother across that room, an old woman standing very small and very still, while a house full of strangers decided quietly what kind of woman she was. What I didn't know was that Denise, standing at the end of the hallway with a laundry basket in her arms, had seen that same necklace sitting on Vanessa's own vanity the morning before it disappeared. I didn't know it because Denise hadn't yet found the courage to say it. That night, lying awake beside my wife, I did something I had never once done in our marriage. I read her the way I'd read an unfamiliar contract, looking for the clause that didn't quite match the rest of the page. I didn't like what that habit said about where we'd ended up. I didn't stop doing it either. Leonard Pike, our family attorney for over 20 years, arrived 2 days later with a folder of paperwork: temporary guardianship, a recommendation for psychiatric evaluation, a transfer to a private care facility in Marietta, the kind of place with a marble lobby and locked wings that everyone agrees to call care instead of what it actually is. Marcus Leonard said, sitting across my own desk like it belonged to him. Sentiment has cost wealthy men everything they built. I've seen it more times than I can count. Protect the company, protect the boy, protect yourself. This woman will be looked after. That's not cruelty. That's prudence. My mother didn't fight when they came for her things. She only looked at me once before she got into the car. A cage with clean sheets, she said quietly, is still a cage. I signed the papers anyway. I want you to sit with that because it's the part of this story I'm least proud of and the part I think matters most. I had found my mother alive after 40 years of believing her dead, and within 3 weeks, under pressure from people I trusted, I put my own signature on the papers that sent her away again. Caleb wouldn't look at me for 2 days. It was Caleb who started asking the questions I should have asked first. He found a pastel-colored envelope in Vanessa's study drawer while looking for a stapler, and inside were drafts of a press statement transfer papers for the Marietta facility and a payment record made out to Leonard Pike dated nearly 2 weeks before the necklace ever went missing. He brought it to Denise before he brought it to me because at 12 he had already learned that some truths need a second witness before an adult will believe a child. Denise finally told him what she'd been too afraid to say. She had watched Vanessa slip that sapphire necklace into a coat pocket in the hallway closet 2 full days before it was reported missing. She'd said nothing because she needed her job and because accusing the woman who signed her paycheck felt like a door that only closed one way. I should have spoken up sooner, Denise told me later, her voice unsteady. I kept telling myself it wasn't my place, but watching that woman get driven away, knowing what I knew, and staying quiet, that wasn't caution, Mr. Whitmore. That was cowardice, and I'm done being that. I asked our security chief to pull the hallway camera footage from the day the necklace disappeared. It was gone, not lost, deleted on a specific date by a login that traced back to Vanessa's private office terminal. But Denise remembered something the technician had forgotten. Our system kept an older backup server in the security room one. Vanessa didn't know still existed because it predated her taking over the foundation's operations 5 years earlier. The footage was still on it. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my study with a glass of water, going warm in my hand, thinking about my mother in a facility in Marietta, believing for all she knew that her own son had chosen his wife's comfort over her freedom. I thought about the bluebird pen sitting now in an evidence bag in my desk drawer, and I understood for the first time that it might be pointing toward more than just my father's memory. I drove to Marietta the next morning alone in a plain navy sweater instead of a suit. My mother didn't ask why I come. She only asked me one question. Do you still know how to listen? I told her I was trying to learn. She asked me to bring her the pen. When I did, she turned it over and her fingers pressed gently at the underside of one wing, and a thin sliver of the enamel backing came loose, revealing a tiny folded scrap of paper tucked inside. On it in handwriting I recognized from an old church program my father used to keep were 4 words: New Hope, choir room, 3rd floor. Your father hid things in places nobody thought to look, my mother said. He learned that from losing things nobody thought to protect. I held that scrap of paper the whole drive back to Atlanta, turning it over the same way she had turned over that pen for 40 years, waiting for someone to finally ask her to show it to them. I took Caleb and Denise with me to New Hope Baptist Church the next afternoon, the same church where my father had once directed the choir, the church I donated to quietly for years without ever asking what was still stored beneath its floors. An elder led us to the choir room, and beneath a loose section of flooring near the back wall, we found a small metal box rusted at the corners but sealed tight. Inside were photographs I had never seen, my mother young holding me as an infant. A letter in my father's handwriting addressed to her that spoke of a fire at the shelter, a fire that had injured her badly enough to keep her hospitalized for months but had not killed her, a hospital discharge note dated a full year after the death certificate I had grown up believing, and beneath all of it, a payment ledger in Leonard Pike's own handwriting, recording transfers made to a facility in another county under a name that was not my mother's. The same year my father's estate was settled. I sat on the floor of that choir room a long time, my son beside me, understanding for the first time that the story I built my whole life on top of had been a lie somebody else chose for me. I confronted Leonard the next morning in his own office, the metal box open on the desk between us. He didn't deny it right away. Men like Leonard rarely do. They negotiate first. Your mother wasn't well after the fire, Marcus. Confused, unable to care for a child or herself. I made a judgment call. I told your father's estate she'd pass because the alternative was a lifetime of legal complications and a child bounced between an unstable mother and an aunt already stretched thin. I believed I was protecting you. You told me she was dead for 40 years. I told you what lets you build the life you have. He gestured at the window at the skyline. Look around, Marcus. Tell me I was wrong. I looked at him a long moment, thinking about my mother sitting alone in Marietta, right then having lost 40 years she could never get back because one man decided without asking her or me what our lives were supposed to look like. You were wrong the day you decided it was your call to make, I said. Not hers, not mine. Later that week, sitting beside my mother's bed in Marietta, I finally asked her to tell me what those missing years had actually looked like. She didn't soften it, and I didn't ask her to. The fire had left her badly burned on one arm and confused for weeks, moved from one facility to another, while paperwork that should have connected her to me simply never did. When she was well enough to ask about her son, she was told gently, firmly, that I'd already been placed with family and that reopening old wounds wouldn't serve either of us. She spent years writing letters to addresses that no longer existed, standing outside offices that wouldn't let her in without documents that had conveniently gone missing until she stopped being treated like a grieving mother and started being treated like a nuisance. Eventually, she told me she stopped being treated like anything at all. She became simply another older woman the city had lost track of. One more name nobody thought to look up twice. I sat with that a long time. 40 years of a woman trying every door she could find while I stood on the other side of every single one of them, never knowing she was knocking. I called everyone back to the house 2 nights later. Vanessa, Leonard, Mayor Ellis Grant, who I'd learned by then knew more about the old bus station property than he'd ever said out loud, Denise, Caleb, and my mother joining by video call from Marietta. Her face small on the screen, but her voice steadier than I'd heard it since the morning I found her. Vanessa stood at the head of the room, composed as always. You're humiliating this family over a woman with memory problems. I placed the bluebird pen on the table. I placed the church documents beside it. Then I played the backup footage, the footage Vanessa didn't know still existed, showing her own hand slipping the sapphire necklace into an old coat pocket in a quiet hallway, 2 days before she reported it stolen. Nobody spoke for a long moment. The mayor set down his glass without drinking from it. Leonard wouldn't meet my eyes. Behind me, Denise let out a breath she'd clearly been holding since she walked in, the sound of someone finally setting down a weight she carried alone too long. I want to be very clear, I said, and my voice carried easily in that quiet room, the way it never needed to be raised to be heard. This isn't a family disagreement anymore. This is a woman who was declared dead, without her knowledge erased from her own son's life, and then nearly erased a second time by people sitting in this room tonight. I protected everything you built, Vanessa said, quiet now, no polish left in her voice. No, you protected the version of me that never asked questions. Caleb spoke up from the back, his voice small but steady. I was more hurt watching you lie than I ever was watching her be poor, he said, looking at Vanessa. There's a difference. I don't think you ever saw it. The DNA results came back that same week, confirmed and undeniable. Ruth Mae Hayes Whitmore was my mother. But the proof that mattered most in that room didn't come from a laboratory. It came from an elder at New Hope who stood in front of everyone and confirmed that Ruth had sung in that choir for years before the fire, that my father had written Bluebird over Auburn Avenue for her, and that Leonard Pike himself had come to the church decades earlier, quietly asking questions about her records. Mayor Grant, cornered by his own silence, finally admitted what he'd known and never said. The redevelopment project behind the old bus station sat on land tied to the very shelter that had caught fire all those years ago, land the city had been eager to redevelop quietly, without ever accounting for the people it had once failed to protect. I should have said something the moment I saw that pen, he told me. I recognized it because my office handled the original shelter fire report. I'm sorry, Marcus. That's not enough, but it's true. One board member set his pen down carefully and didn't pick it back up. Another simply stared at a framed photograph of the choir the elder had brought my mother's young face near the end of the second row, my father standing just behind her. Nobody in that room needed a second explanation of what they were looking at. Some truths don't require volume. They only need enough time to settle into a quiet room, and that room had finally gone quiet enough to let it. Leonard Pike's law license would not survive the investigation that followed. Vanessa's control of the Whitmore Legacy Foundation ended that same week, not with shouting, but with a quiet vote of the board she'd once run without question. I drove to Marietta myself to bring her home in the same Navy sweater, no assistant, no car service. I brought you into my house once already, I told her. Now I'm asking you to come home. And if your world laughs at me again, then they can laugh from outside our gate, not from inside it. Denise opened the front door for us herself this time. Caleb had placed the bluebird pen on a small velvet cushion in the foyer, waiting for her, the same spot where a security guard had once asked whether he should call a medical transport for a woman he assumed was a stranger. She walked into that house this time without anyone questioning whether she belonged. Vanessa left the mansion quietly, without the scene I once imagined a moment like this would require. No shouting in the inn, just silence and a car pulling away down a long driveway. She used to walk like she owned every inch of it. I didn't seek revenge because revenge was never what my mother needed, and it was never who I wanted my son to watch me become. I handed every piece of evidence to the appropriate authorities. I froze the foundation's accounts pending a full outside audit, and I stood in front of our remaining donors myself and told them plainly that I had let paperwork outweigh my own mother's pain and that I would spend whatever time I had left making that right. Out of that, we built something new. The Bluebird Homecoming Fund, dedicated to elderly homeless women separated from their families, funding legal aid for people whose records have been altered or erased, and building small emergency housing near the very bus station where I found her on land once meant only for luxury towers. I thought more than once about how easy it would have been to write a check and call it justice. A donation is comfortable. It lets you feel generous without ever having to sit with what you almost let happen. I didn't want comfort. I wanted the fund to carry my mother's actual name, Ruth May Hayes Whitmore, printed plainly on every piece of paperwork it ever produced, so no one working inside it could forget that the woman it existed for once had a name nobody bothered to check. A year later, my mother still wakes at 5 in the morning out of habit. I've stopped trying to talk her out of it. I converted a sunlit room upstairs into a sewing space for her filled with fabric and a record player that only plays gospel. Caleb has learned two more of my father's old songs by heart. Denise now directs outreach for the Bluebird Fund, the same woman who once stayed silent out of fear, now standing in front of rooms to make sure other people aren't silenced the way she was. The luxury tower behind the old bus station was redesigned. Part of it is still market housing. Part of it is now a shelter and legal aid center, with the Bluebird pen repaired and framed hanging in the entrance where every visitor can see it. Caleb asked me once, sitting on the back porch at dusk, whether I regretted ever signing those transfer papers. I told him the truth. I regret it every day, and I've stopped trying to make the regret smaller than it is. Carrying it honestly is more useful than pretending it never happened. It keeps me slower to sign things now and quicker to ask questions before I decide what's best for someone I claim to love. Not long ago, I watched a new visitor step through those doors, an elderly woman clutching an old photograph, unsure whether anyone inside would believe her story. My mother walked over before I could. Ask her who she's trying to find. She told me, and this time I didn't wait for a document or a test before I sat down beside her. The shelter opened on a clear Saturday morning in April, and I hadn't expected the turnout it got. Mayor Ellis Grant stood at the podium himself, not because I asked him to, but because he asked me first. In the months since that emergency meeting, he had quietly rewritten the redevelopment agreement, folding the shelter and legal aid center into the city's own commitments instead of leaving it a private gesture from one wealthy family. I knew about the shelter fire records years before Mr. Whitmore ever found his mother. He told the crowd, I let a quiet redevelopment move forward instead of asking who that land still owed something to. I'm not proud of that. I'm proud to stand here today correcting it. I watched my mother's face while he spoke. She didn't look triumphant. She looked, if anything, a little embarrassed by the size of the crowd, the way people who've spent years being overlooked often do when a room finally turns to look at them on purpose. After the ribbon was cut, we moved the gathering 3 blocks over to New Hope Baptist Church, where the choir my father once directed still met every Sunday. My mother hadn't sung in public in longer than I'd been alive to remember her singing at all. She stood at the front of that sanctuary in a simple blue dress, no microphone, just her voice and the old upright piano someone had kept in tune out of habit more than necessity. She sang Bluebird over Auburn Avenue, the way I imagine my father must have first heard it, slow, a little unsteady, in places more feeling than performance. Caleb stood beside her and picked up the second verse when her voice caught the two of them finishing the song together while the whole room went still. In the particular way a room goes still when it understands it's witnessing something it won't get to witness twice. I didn't try to hold back what I felt sitting in that pew. I spent 40 years believing that song no longer belonged to anyone living. Hearing it again from the two people I love most, I finally understood what my father meant when he told me the bird would know home was real. He hadn't been talking about a pen at all. He'd been talking about a voice that would still be recognizable, no matter how many years passed before it was heard again. I want to tell you honestly what became of my marriage, because this story wouldn't be truthful if I skipped past it. Vanessa and I finalized our divorce quietly, without the public war I once might have wanted. She kept her name off the foundation entirely, and to her credit, she didn't fight the settlement the way Leonard once advised other men in her position to fight theirs. I ran into her only once after that, months later, at a fundraiser neither of us realized the other was attending. She looked smaller somehow, not physically, but the way a person looks when they've stopped performing for a room and simply exist in it. I heard she's doing well, Vanessa said, meaning my mother unable to say her name. She is. Vanessa nodded, looked at her hands, and said the only honest thing I ever heard her say about that whole year. I told myself I was protecting the family. I think I was only ever protecting my place in it. She didn't ask for forgiveness, and I didn't offer any I didn't feel. But I didn't carry anger into that room either because by then I learned that anger is its own kind of cage, and I'd already watched what a cage does to a person who deserved better than one. Leonard Pike sent a letter through his new counsel sometime later, brief and carefully worded, stopping just short of an apology. I didn't answer it. Some debts aren't settled with paper, and I'd grown tired of pretending paper could settle the things that actually mattered. I think often about what my son will carry forward from all of this long after I'm the age my own father was when he passed. I won't remember the deal that made me wealthy, or the tower we built downtown, or any of the boardrooms where I once thought a man's worth was decided. He told me as much himself, sitting on the church steps after the dedication, watching his grandmother laugh with Denise over something neither of them would repeat to me. I'm going to remember that you went back for her, he said, even after you got it wrong the first time. I asked what he meant. Most people just try not to mess up, he said. You messed up and then you fixed it in front of everybody instead of pretending you didn't. I think that's harder, actually. 12 years old, and he'd already understood something it took his father 50 to learn. Dignity is not never being wrong. Dignity is what you do the moment you find out you were. This story taught me something I wish I'd understood 40 years earlier. A cracked pen, a soaked blanket, and a woman's voice calling a name nobody else remembered were never signs of a con. They were the last pieces of proof a family had left after the world decided her story wasn't worth protecting. If someone you love came back into your life broken, older, harder to recognize, would you still know how to welcome them home? Or would you need a lawyer, a test, and a room full of witnesses before you trusted your own heart? Tell me in the comments. And if you believe no mother should ever have to prove her worth at the door of her own child's house, type bluebird so I know you're still with me.